American soldiers and Marines were dying in the dense jungles of Vietnam because their close air support aircraft were, in effect, relics of the Second World War. Every operation became a deadly gamble, with pilots flying machines better suited for museum displays, while the North Vietnamese enemy received increasingly sophisticated weapons from the Soviet Union. The Douglas Sky Raider, a veteran of the Korean War, struggled to perform a role for which it was no longer truly capable. Piston engines roared above the thick jungle canopy as ground troops pleaded for help from ever more desperate positions. The United States Air Force faced a crisis of unprecedented proportions, and time was running out at an alarming rate. Without effective close air support, Army units, Marines, South Korean forces, and other Allied troops could barely hold their ground against the Viet Cong and the disciplined North Vietnamese Army. Casualties mounted week after week, while commanders in the field sent increasingly desperate reports, demanding modern aircraft capable of properly protecting them during combat operations. The situation was made even worse by a bureaucratic dispute that threatened to paralyze any rapid solution. Since September 1947, when the Army lost its air arm and the U.S. Air Force was created as an independent service, strict restrictions had existed on what types of fixed-wing aircraft the Army could operate. This artificial division created severe operational problems, as ground troops depended entirely on pilots from another service branch for support during combat. Coordination between different services consumed precious time, while soldiers died waiting for assistance. Frustrated by this critical dependence, the Army decided to take matters into its own hands and launched its own program, known as the Advanced Aerial Fire Support System. The result of this initiative was the Lockheed AH-56 Cheyenne attack helicopter, a revolutionary machine that promised to change the rules of the battlefield entirely. However, the Air Force perceived the Cheyenne as a direct threat to its dominance over combat aviation and moved to counter it with immediate urgency. General John P. McConnell, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, fully understood that not only the lives of thousands of soldiers were at stake, but also the institutional prestige of his entire service. If the Army succeeded in developing a more effective close support system than anything the Air Force could offer, the political consequences would be devastating. McConnell knew he had to act quickly and decisively to avoid being sidelined in this inter-service struggle. In December 1966, the Air Force finally issued a formal requirements directive aimed at developing an aircraft dedicated exclusively to close air support, incorporating the latest available technologies. By March 1967, this directive had evolved into the AX Program Office, short for Attack Experimental, with the specific mission of designing the aircraft that would save the Air Force's reputation. The Program Office established highly ambitious baseline parameters and distributed technical specifications to more than 20 defense contractors through a formal request for information. Industry giants such as Grumman, McDonnell, General Dynamics, and Northrop received multiple study contracts to develop the best possible design, taking into account armor, avionics, engines, fuel systems, and armament. The Air Force sought an aircraft with low operating costs, excellent low-altitude maneuverability, minimal maintenance requirements, heavy weapons payload capacity, the ability to operate from improvised airfields, a rugged structure to maximize pilot survivability, and a top speed exceeding 400 miles per hour. While contractors worked feverishly on their proposals, the war in Indochina continued to claim American lives daily, and political pressure on the Air Force increased relentlessly. As aerospace engineers refined the preliminary EX designs, the global geopolitical landscape unexpectedly began to interfere with the project. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union reached alarming levels in Europe, and Pentagon strategists continuously ran simulations of how to respond to a potential Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Army and Air Force analysts studied scenarios in which massive waves of Soviet armored divisions would cross borders with tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, crushing any existing conventional resistance. The conclusions were deeply disturbing. U.S. and NATO forces stationed along the front lines would require massive close air support to have any realistic chance of stopping such an armored onslaught. The Air Force made a critical decision that fundamentally altered the original AX requirements. What had initially been designed to fight guerrillas in the jungles of Vietnam now had to confront Soviet military power on the plains of Europe. New technical demands included a maximum speed exceeding 460 miles per hour, a takeoff distance of less than 4,000 feet, an operational radius of 285 miles, a payload capacity of 16,000 pounds, and an estimated unit cost of nearly $1 million. In addition, planners demanded an all-weather aircraft capable of operating under adverse meteorological conditions and armed with a devastating cannon capable of destroying the most modern Soviet tanks. This radical shift transformed the project into something far more ambitious and complex than originally envisioned. The Air Force decided to issue a separate request for proposals specifically for the aircraft's primary weapon system. Veteran pilots from the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps were extensively consulted regarding the real-world performance of the 20mm M61 Vulcan rotary cannon. During combat missions in Vietnam, the Vulcan had become the standard weapon on many fixed and rotary-wing aircraft, and the Air Force highly valued the opinions of those who had used it in life-or-death situations. The general consensus among pilots was that the 20mm cannon was highly effective against most ground targets and exceptionally reliable mechanically. However, pilots also reported a critical flaw that became increasingly problematic as North Vietnam received more heavily armored vehicles from its communist allies. The Vulcan simply lacked sufficient penetration power against thick armor, forcing pilots to make multiple extremely dangerous attack passes over the same target. The Air Force concluded that it urgently needed a rotary cannon of much larger caliber for the AX aircraft. Specifications called for a massive 30mm weapon with a desired rate of fire exceeding 4,000 rounds per minute, capable of turning any Soviet tank into smoking scrap with short bursts. Only two companies submitted designs for this monstrous cannon, Philco Ford and General Electric. Both corporations invested enormous resources into developing functional prototypes of this revolutionary weapon. By mid-1971, the rotary cannon prototype received its official designation, GU-8. The Air Force also requested the development of 4 different types of specialized ammunition: armor-piercing incendiary, target practice, high-explosive incendiary, and semi-armor-piercing high-explosive. Each projectile type served a specific combat role depending on the intended target. By 1974, the most powerful aircraft-mounted gun ever built was finally ready to enter service and permanently changed the rules of air-to-ground combat. 6 aerospace companies submitted full aircraft proposals, but Air Force evaluators selected only Northrop and Fairchild Republic as finalists. In December 1970, both companies received contracts to build flyable prototypes. The official designations were YA-9 for Northrop and YA-10 for Fairchild Republic. Northrop engineers pursued a conventional but highly efficient approach. Their aircraft visually resembled an enlarged Bell P-59 Aerocomet, America's first jet aircraft of the Second World War. The YA-9 was a monoplane constructed entirely of riveted aluminum alloy, using chemically milled skins and honeycomb structures to provide exceptional strength without unnecessary weight. It featured straight, high-mounted wings that offered ample space for underwing stores. All fuel was housed within the wings rather than the central fuselage, keeping flammable material away from potential ignition sources and preventing catastrophic failure if the aircraft was hit by enemy fire at low altitude. The wing design provided excellent control at low level, an essential trait for close air support missions flown just above treetop height. The cockpit was positioned forward, ahead of the wing's leading edge, enclosed by a bubble canopy that provided outstanding visibility in all directions. The pilot sat within an armored bathtub made of aluminum on the prototype, intended to be titanium in production models for superior protection against light anti-aircraft fire and shrapnel. The cockpit controls were standard for the era, allowing experienced pilots to adapt quickly without extensive retraining. The YA-9 featured a dual hydraulic flight control system with manual backup, ensuring continued controllability even after combat damage. Power came from 2 Lycoming YF-102LD 100 turbofan engines, each producing 7,000 pounds of thrust and enabling a top speed exceeding 520 miles per hour. Derived from the Avco-Lycoming T-55 used in the CH-47 Chinook, the engines provided a climb rate of 5,000 feet per minute. Mounted under the wings on either side of the fuselage, the engines exhausted near the tail, reducing the aircraft's infrared signature. A large cruciform tail enhanced low-level directional stability. Split ailerons could function as speed brakes, allowing rapid deceleration during attack runs, while coordinated control inputs improved weapons aiming accuracy. The aircraft featured a low-profile landing gear, with main gear positioned near the center of mass and a nose gear beneath the cockpit. Although intended to carry the GU-8, the cannon was not yet ready, so the prototype was armed with the smaller 20mm M61 Vulcan. The YA-9 had 10 underwing hardpoints capable of carrying up to 16,000 pounds of ordnance, including AGM-65 Maverick missiles. The first prototype flew on May 30, 1972, followed by a second aircraft in late August. Test pilots were deeply impressed, praising its handling, responsiveness, and superb visibility. The aircraft felt like a true combat fighter rather than a slow, clumsy attack platform. Between October and December 1972, both prototypes underwent rigorous comparative testing at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The YA-9 met all Air Force requirements and excelled in speed, range, payload, and low-altitude maneuverability. Pilots consistently praised its predictable handling and robust control systems. However, evaluators identified key survivability advantages in the YA-10. Its externally mounted engines reduced infrared and radar signatures and allowed the aircraft to return home even after losing one engine. High-mounted intakes minimized foreign object damage during low-level operations from rough airstrips. In contrast, the YA-9's low-mounted engines were more vulnerable to debris ingestion and structural damage. Ultimately, survivability under intense anti-aircraft fire proved decisive. Despite the YA-9's technical excellence and pilot preference, the Air Force selected the YA-10 for production. The YA-9 prototypes were transferred to NASA for further research, and their engines were later used in a quiet short takeoff transport research program. Meanwhile, the YA-10 entered production as the A-10 Thunderbolt II, better known as the Warthog, becoming one of the most legendary close air support aircraft in history. The AX program remains a powerful lesson. Technical superiority alone does not guarantee victory. In combat aviation, survivability and pilot protection can outweigh every other metric.